your FOIA requests, how many, since you've been there, how many have you made?
Oh, well over 400. Well over 400.
How does it work? I mean, give us an example. Who decides inside your organization, and how does it start?
Well, we have a small board. Our director
Inside your organization, and how does it start?
Well, we have a small board. Our director of litigation, Paul Orphanides, is our chief lawyer, has been there forever, since the beginning of the organization. Chris Farrell, who's our director of investigations, is a former counterintelligence official. He worked in the Army. He's our director of investigations, and they have a staff. And you know, FOIA investigations are easy to generate. It means sending a letter. We have a general letter that we have to the agency about a topic of interest to us. Now, some topics we may just be personally interested in, that, you know, that maybe people generally wouldn't be interested. Other topics have a broad range of public import. And as I said earlier, it's just fascinating to me. Just what occurs to us to ask about doesn't occur to everyone else to ask about. And recently, well, actually, back in October, after the reported meeting that Henry Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, had with the top banks in October, where the banks were complaining they were forced to take TARP funds. Well, you know, I thought that was interesting. I'm sure everyone else might think it was interesting. It was an historic intervention in our economy and in our private sector by the government. We asked for the records of the meeting a few days later. And you know, the Bush administration stonewalled. They didn't give us a response. They had a few months. The Obama administration came to us in early February and said they had no documents, which obviously was crazy. They obviously had to have documents about such an important meeting. And so we had filed a lawsuit, and sure enough, our pressure resulted in the release of documents just earlier this month that show, at least if Paulson's talking points, which we obtained, are to be believed, that the banks were forced to take the money, that they were said that if you didn't want the money, your regulators will require you to take it. And sitting at the table was Timothy Geithner, then New York Fed, now Treasury Secretary, Ben Bernanke, then, well, still Fed Chair, Sheila Blair, then and still FDIC Chairman. So all the top regulators of the government were sitting there, and it was a really, in my view, a thuggish enterprise, that whole meeting. But again, a huge, huge story in terms of its impact on our nation's economic life. And it was only Judicial Watch who asked and litigated about it, and just to find out what went on at the meeting. And I'm not sure we got everything that went on at the meeting, but certainly the press paid attention when we released the information.
When you release one of your reports and you've accomplished something, or you're going after somebody, how does the media treat you?
I think they treat us with respect. I think the media likes groups that present news as opposed to spin and angles. And, you know, the documents are what they are. We can present them. We can analyze them. But because we have the primary documents and make them available to the media, you know, they're gonna report on it independently. So I think the media really loves what we do because I can't tell you how many reporters I've talked to who have pending, but they never get an answer from the government, and their media organizations don't have the resources to litigate. But we do, because we get the sort of public support I've been talking about.
Are there media organizations that won't cover you because you're a conservative organization?
No. We have good relations with virtually every media operation. I mean, I've had stories in the New York Times written about our work that has just been incredible. You know, one important story we had done, piece of information we had uncovered. Remember back in the day when there was a dispute about the bombing of the Al-Qaeda supposed aspirin factory in the Sudan, and we had asked for documents about that back in 2000, I guess is when it happened. 5 years later, we didn't even sue over it. The State Department gave us a document, an intelligence document they had produced about bin Laden in 1996, fleeing the Sudan to Afghanistan and suggesting he would be a threat to U.S. interests worldwide. He had been tied to prior terrorist incidents, and his financial and other networks were going to be a real significant problem. If it had been written on 9/12, it would have been seen as useful and prescient. But here it was written in 1996, and we knew everything we needed to know about bin Laden and the threat and danger and crimes he's already committed, and crimes of terror he'd already committed. And it seemed to me the Clinton administration didn't do anything about it, despite giving this information. This was not hindsight being 20/20. They knew in 1996 that bin Laden was a bad actor and a murderous terrorist, and they didn't do anything about it. And the New York Times story essentially pointed that out, which I thought was tremendous.
Why did the State Department release that to you? Was that a FOI?
Because it was in response to this request we had about the bombing of the pharmaceutical factory in the Sudan and bin Laden. And 5 years later, it came across our door.
What is the difference? You've been here in the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration. What is the difference between Democratic administrations and Republican administrations?
In terms of transparency?
Just as you work with them, and is there a way to define that? Is there a difference?
Well, rhetorically, there's always a difference. Bill Clinton paid homage to transparency and said that you should err on the side of disclosure. But I pointed out this Commerce case where they were shredding documents, and the court was very upset with their lawless approach to releasing information. The Bush administration came, so we had fights with the Clinton administration even though it was committed to transparency. The Bush administration came in and said, well, we don't want to give you documents because we don't think we have to. So they were not committed to transparency. So the fights continued. Now the Obama administration, it's early, but they say they're committed to transparency, but as I said earlier, they tried to cover up the fact these Treasury documents existed. I'm concerned that all of these czars that are being created in the White House, whether it be the car czar, the climate czar, or other czars, bring policy making and decision making out of the agencies and into the White House, therefore protecting what they're doing from disclosure, where it might otherwise be subject to disclosure if, for instance, climate change was being run out of EPA versus Carol Bronner in the White House. So I think there's going to be a rhetorical bows given to transparency by the Obama administration, but in the end, the government releases what it wants to release, usually for its own reasons. And sometimes I wonder when we get individual documents like the State Department document I talked about earlier, was there someone who kind of thought this was an important document that needed to get out, and it was more directed at us than you might think. We had that similar experience with the Cheney Energy Task Force. Months after we had initiated the litigation and long after a court deadline, we received a single document in the mail from the Commerce Department, and it was a map of oil fields in the Middle East and expected contracts associated with various countries and their oil resources. And among those countries listed was a list of contracts, potential and otherwise, for Iraq. And I thought, whoa, I know how people are going to read this, because this was I think it came out to us after the Iraq War began. People who opposed the Iraq War are going to say, oh, look, Cheney's Energy Task Force was scoping out Iraq in terms of oil, so the war was for oil. Others might have looked at it and said, it was the Energy Task Force. They were calculating where in the Middle East we were getting our oil and who was running the contracts and who was the power players there. So, but that document is a big hit on our website, and the left always cites to that in terms of trying to advocate for their point that it was a war for oil. But I thought it was interesting we got the document by itself in a separate envelope in a way that highlighted it. So I wonder if there was an angel or someone with an agenda at the Commerce Department who wanted to get this out. What can you tell us about Larry Klayman, your founder, suing you? I can't. We're in a dispute, and my lawyers have told me not to talk about it. But, hopefully it will end. Can you tell us where it is in the court system? I think it's at the end game, but we'll see. We'll see. The courts are considering, in the big case, the courts are considering summary judgment motions, so we'll see what happens. Can you, without commenting on what's right or wrong about this, tell us exactly what the suit's about?